Okay, the Renaissance. There's a lot of stuff in the Renaissance, so I'm going to try to go over this, not speed through, but quickly. Usually people talk about a Renaissance 1 and 2, an early and a late Renaissance. So the earlier Renaissance tends to be around Italy, especially around Florence. And we're talking about it's mostly visual, not exclusively, but mostly. And the high Renaissance or the later Renaissance tends to be on the northern side of Europe and is more, but not exclusively, literary. So Shakespeare, later Renaissance, right? And the big three, the people, the artist, the Ninja Turtles, as the students like to say. There are the names anyway. This is the early Renaissance. And the book is not covering, the book takes both of our books actually take a little bit different approach than other books, and that they don't privilege the fall of Constantinople. Okay, so Constantinople is this. So then the kind of overly simplistic explanation that was never really true, but people like to use these things as markers. And I want to say it was 1453, but don't quote me on the year. Constantinople falls. So the Byzantine Empire, remember that we talked about before, that was it was down to just the city at the end of it. And the Turks take control of Constantinople. Well, before then, people were leaving. So scholarly people, artists, architects were leaving the city, and they were going to Italy. Well, why? Because, 1,200 years before that, I guess their ancestors came from that region, but it's still part of the Roman, or like the old sort of Roman Empire, right? And there wasn't really a whole lot of other places to go, but they don't exclusively go there. And so, for instance, if you've ever heard some of the modern states try to say that, well, we're the Romans. Like we're the living heirs to the Roman Empire. Putin says this, Vladimir Putin in Russia. What he means by that is a convoluted story about how, and this is not entirely untrue, but what he's saying is not exactly true, about how a certain segment of people, when Constantinople fell, they went north. Right? And I think by his logic ended up turning into the czars, right? And so notice the name, right? Caesar, Julius Caesar, and the czar. So the word changes over time, like they all do, right? I don't think I went in this term, the evolution of Easter, like how we get an Easter bunny and eggs along with the resurrection of Jesus. And it has to do with an ancient fertility rite in the Mediterranean and ancient Egypt that got smashed together later on when the Christian missionaries came through and were directed to combine, in their minds, pagan festivals because the previous missionary were getting killed. So maybe I'll pick that up at some other point, but usually the big holidays are a combination of a few things that don't necessarily make sense. So Santa, around the birth of Jesus, it doesn't make any. By the way, Santa's way older than Jesus, though the story goes way, way back into antiquity. Of Santa, I think, if I remember correctly, for a few hundred years was a woman, and we just lost that sense of it. So, okay, so they used to make a whole lot about the fall of Constantinople, is what I'm saying, and the book does not as much. It just kind of elides or moves, shifts easily into this period, and it's not a hard switch like some texts make it out to be. It probably wasn't really as hard as those texts were making out to be anyway. I'm just saying it's different. Okay, so what's going on in this earlier part? Individualism is coming back. So I'm important. They're going to like the Greeks, is the long story short, because the Greeks are highly individualistic. And over the course of the Middle Ages, remember we're going to tend to value God's important. My ruler is important. I am not really that important, right? But now this is, and I'm being I'm stressing probably too much here. Now, in my it's not, we're not to the point to where my feelings are going to matter as much like they do a few hundred years past this time when we get to Romanticism. But we're moving in that direction, especially for highly creative or important people. It takes a while to get there for ordinary middle class people. Matter of fact, we don't even have a middle class still. It's usually just poor people and aristocrats. How did we get there? We're kind of still in the Middle Ages here on the tail end of it. The Black Death. Probably the bubonic plague. We don't actually know that for sure, but it does seem most of the evidence points in that direction. It's very difficult to get a biological sample. Like, how would you get one? Because all the biological, it's going to decompose. So, but from the descriptions of what people had in various places, it does seem like that. This was enormous. So this had been around, by the way, for a long, long time. It came in waves. It came, with back with the Huns, way back when. It's just that now it's back again, and it's really devastating. And it doesn't necessarily hit all at once. It'll hit for a few years, retreat, come back, and so that over like a few decades, it may be the case that most of the people are dead. And it was an awful way to die. And so it's not like students, first of all, don't present over the Black Death because that's a natural phenomenon. You want to present over like a work or a person that's affected by the Black Death, because that way you can argue what drove the creation of the work or the person. But the Black Death itself is not like COVID at all. Students always want to say, well, I know all about this because we had to lock down in COVID. No, but you didn't like look to your left, look to your right, and either one or both of your friends, everybody around you is going to be dead. Society just fell apart completely. And like we have not seen anything like that. It would be, for us to see something like that, it would have to be, if you've ever heard of like some of the scientists start talking about what they have already seen with when H5N1 gets out of control, so bird flu, and it's only a couple mutations. Really, the real trick to all that is when they get nasty, it's that they get less deadly because then they can spread. But the ones that they've seen, they kind of kill themselves out because they're so deadly. But if you get a less deadly version of that H5N, of one of those nasty strains that they've seen, we'll be back in lockdown again, regardless of who's president and what the political situations are. Just because you'll start seeing half a population's wiped out. Okay, the rise of the constitutional monarchy. So we're not to democracy yet. We're still a long way off to America. But we are going to talk about here King John, who is King Richard's the brother. So remember the Robin Hood stories, and they're waiting for King Richard to get back. But this is King John and King Richard are both the sons of Eleanor of Aquitaine. And I was talking in the screencast about how to do one of your presentations, how that would be Eleanor of Aquitaine is a wonderful subject to pick because she lives such an interesting and rich life. But King John is the bad son, essentially. Taxed his people. This is the one that Robin Hood and his merry band are rising to take money, not necessarily directly from King John, but from the rich people around, because the rich people are getting all the money and they want to steal from the rich and give to the poor. In the story, as a matter of fact, it was so bad with King John, and he had such a penchant for wanting to go fight these campaigns everywhere, that not normal people, but the lords, the people who were funding all of these campaigns, got together, said, "Wait a minute, buddy, we're gonna." They got him. Essentially restrained him and said, you're gonna sign this thing. You're gonna agree to the Magna Carta. It ends up falling off not too long after this time period, but this is the beginning of what's gonna be the really important documents in America. This is the germ, the seed of something an idea that's really going to take hold in the Enlightenment, and then it's going to become a political experiment at the time in America. But we're ways off from all that. But if you're interested in law, do try to present over the Magna Carta. The 100 Years' War, I skipped over this entirely before, but when we say the Normans, the Northmen, the people who decided to settle on the north side of France, were the Vikings, right? So they came in and settled, eventually intermarried with the local population, and now are the Normans, right? So not the Northmen, but now the Normans. And it was William the Conqueror in 1066 that came from this coast and took over England. And it's a strange situation that people don't really think through, that all the legitimate kings that cause the bloodlines cause so many problems in England later on are actually going back to a Norman. So this William the Conqueror is considered to have the pure blood. God, I guess, wanted him to take over, so the logic goes. So they all tried to trace their lineage back to him. And so even in Shakespeare's day, Shakespeare wrote a lot of history plays, and he's talking about the houses and the tensions about who has a better blood claim to the throne. And Shakespeare's doing a lot of work later on to kind of make it appear that the Lancasters have a better claim to the throne than are the legitimate rulers, and not the other house at the time. And that wasn't entirely to the Yorks. And it's not entirely true, and Shakespeare's in part a propagandist, but people don't like to talk about that. But he had to, or he would have, it helped their whole company at the time. Okay, the longbow was really important invention. It worked in bad weather. The English probably and mostly took over this whole area of France because of the longbow. And it was so bad for a while. If you ever seen an old movie, and you can sort of see from the movie quickly how when you flip off someone, when the English people do, it's with two fingers and not with a middle finger. This is because of the longbow. Because way back in the day, so really we're still in the Middle Ages here, there's a huge bartering system about how you would, an earl is worth so many knights and so on. And if you, when one company came in and captured another company, they're not going to kill them. Most of them, the ones that they can keep, because then they're going to want to trade them. And they had an elaborate trading system. And so the archers, they would love to get a hold of the longbow archers, because they were just getting peppered. The French people were. And so, but what they would do is they would get a hand axe and they would chop off their two fingers so they couldn't shoot a longbow anymore. So they'd trade them back, but you're not going to get me with that bow anymore was the idea. And so the existing, when they got traded, everybody knew this because it's still fairly close, even though it's a long distance with this particular bow. It's only relative to what they were using before. So the English people at the time would hold their two fingers, meaning I'm going to kill you or screw you. Right, so you'll see this in some old movie. That's what they're talking. It's not the peace sign like it is for us today. Joan of Arc, I referenced before. She was a threat, even though caused some damage from her. So got people to follow her. Ultimately caused damage to the existing authorities because she was claiming to communicate with God directly. So what do you need the church for? Right? This sort of thing is, the books, both of our books don't touch on this as much as you could if you were interested in a figure like this to present over. Decline of the church. Well, they're going to say it's because of the Avignon papacy and the Great Schism. Really, it's an old organization at this point. It's kind of like a lot of organizations that run. It had problems, right? Because any organization over time tends to look after itself first and primarily. It makes sure it extends its own, hopefully extends its own power. So the things that showed up, I'm going to say these are symptomatic or of a much deeper thing, was that some of the popes left and had like I said, we're going to have another papal center in Avignon, which is a beautiful part of France, and then later on with the Great Schism. And so, but there were two. There was a pope in Rome and a pope in Avignon for a while, and then later on with this schism, they were trying to this business here with simony, to level additional taxes upon the clergy, and then what really upset people were the sale of indulgences, pardons from temporal penalties for sin. So if you had a really bad life, you could buy your way out of it, buy your way into heaven. that's the idea of an indulgence. And not just for you, we all have a crazy Uncle Buck, right? Or in my case, a different name of a crazy uncle who did all just insane youth, right? My uncle was so crazy that he literally ended up running away and with the carnies or the carnival when he was 16, I think. But this is back in Kentucky where all sorts of crazy things happen. Appalachia is a really crazy place if you've never lived there. But anyway, that I could buy. So he's still living, but if he was dead, the idea is, and you knew he lived a really sinful life, I can buy his way out of purgatory and into heaven was the idea. So that really upset people, especially even Martin Luther way back is going to have a whole lot to say about this. The Arts in Transition, Boccaccio. So he wrote the Decameron, which is going to be the kind of a blueprint for us for what Chaucer is going to pick up this theme of you're traveling somewhere important and you're going to have people tell stories along the way. But if you wanted to research Boccaccio, like he's a way to not present over the plague itself, but a work associated with the plague. Some of these stories are ways to talk about something else. Christine de Pizan, hugely important. And look at the time period here. Right, so in this day and age, very rare. All right, attacked the long anti-female tradition that had demeaned women and denied them the right to a university education. This is not really going to get picked up until Mary Wollstonecraft, several hundred years from now. And it's going to be the case later. Mary Wollstonecraft on the other side of the Enlightenment, or getting near the other side of the Enlightenment anyway, is going to make a profound case for women. And that's going to be the sort of the long-lasting tradition that we inherit today. But these are the early, not really tremors, because she's full on out there talking about this, but it'll get picked up to a greater degree by the public, I guess I would say, later. Literacy is still it's really low in this time period. So she knows how to read and write, but not necessarily a whole lot of other people. Chaucer is an absolute hoot. If you've never heard, a lot of students, it seems like, followed that movie from, I don't know, a decade or a couple decades ago, I guess. Chaucer himself, very witty, just scathing in his critique of clerical abuses and hypocrisy, makes fun of all sorts of religious and other important figures, and he creates very lifelike characters. And so he does things that nobody was doing at the time. So in our age, the wife of Bath is a favorite character, and she's extremely ostentatious. She's gaudy. She'll openly talk about how she likes sex and how some of her husbands were really good in bed and she didn't like these other and all that sort of stuff, which it seems absolutely scandalous at the time, and I guess to a certain extent it was. Chaucer, sort of the first modern poet, I guess, is what he gets called, the father of or English poetry. But he writes in Middle English, so it's still really difficult to understand. And it was on the other side of what we now call a great vowel shift. So a lot of the talk is higher. So if you can do this on your own if you want to. If you want to go to YouTube and listen to Middle English and just notice how, like, the pitch in how people talked was very different and often higher than we would talk today. We don't necessarily know why we go through vowel shift. It's not the only vowel shift the world has been through. But he was before the great vowel shift in our case, where Shakespeare's on our side of it. It's not anywhere near as difficult to read a Shakespearean plays. It is to go back and, even though it's not, you can do it with just a little bit of training. You can go back and read Chaucer Canterbury Tales after you get in the spirit of it. Chiaroscuro, the lighting. Notice, just where the lighting is and how it changes. This looks very different from the last few paintings we looked at. Starting to get some depth here now too. Same thing here. We still have the halos. Okay, that's not playing for me. Hopefully it's playing for y'all. Italian Renaissance, or the visual, as people like to call it, the early Renaissance. And so just if you didn't catch where all these cities were before, they're still same place. Medici. That's a really powerful thing. There's a PBS. I think it's PBS. Maybe it's some other thing. Documentary on these. That's I think it's like 4, 5, 6 full DVDs. It'll take you through the ins and outs of their family. They were power brokers, rich, influential, ruthless. Sometimes appointed the popes. Got them appointed, right? Seemingly anyway. Right, for a lot of generations on the north side of Italy. And also we're like, look at all the names associated with them. Right? So the power behind a lot of this and money behind a lot of that stuff. What's going to rise over time? Classical humanism. The idea that humans become more important. People, individuals. Because what I think and what I can create becomes more important. So in other words, not just like I'm here, I'm going to live my life in strict obedience to God and to the local authority, and then I'm going to die. Right? So we're getting away from that is the idea. Petrarch, father of humanism. Well, it's probably no coincidence that this has this, so we're still early, right? He's writing to his most famous stuff anyway. He's writing to Laura as his love. She died early. He keeps writing to her, and he creates this. We now sonnet, a 14-line lyric poem. He creates it's a different rhyme scheme in Italian, and it's easier to rhyme things in Italian. But for whatever reason that we don't fully understand, it seems like this just burst, as it were, of words. There's only so many syllables in a sonnet. It seems to always go back to human love, and love in the sense that we use the word love, which is different than how the ancients used to use the word love. So the way we use it now is like this is close to what we mean. Whereas before, if you go back and say, well, Zeus fell in love with this. No, he didn't. That means lust. That doesn't mean love. It just gets translated love. And then also, probably, by the way, the change probably deals with Eleanor of Aquitaine as well. She had this game for a while where she would make the sort of the knights of the court composed to the women, and it was the way that they were passing the time. Then it seems like it anyway. Nobody really knows for sure, but it's one of the better ideas. And that it just caught on because her court was really influential. Castiglione, the well-rounded person. This is what we mean by he's just writing down what a lot of people were doing at the time. The Renaissance man. You should be able to do everything. Well, you should be able to fight. And you should be able to be athletic in other ways. But you should also be able to speak a lot of languages and negotiate transactions. One of the reasons this came into prominence, notice that we're a couple hundred years from just a few scrolls ago, is because when you advanced and dispatch people based off of their relation or loyalty to the crown, right? It has historically cost people money. So, for example, I'm going to go across the sea here and to the bad-tempered king Henry VIII. Had a famous temper. He would go off on people. Even in Henry VIII's court, he started promoting people based on, he didn't necessarily like them, but if he thought that they were really smart, had abilities, could speak languages, he would want to start to send those people to Italy, to France. And really, we mean the courts, not just the country in general. They're going to negotiate trade deals. Well, why? Because if you've got Northumbria's son, Northumbria's been like it's just a earl, let's say, in the day, and he wants to get his son in a good place. So that's one of the things his son can do as a young man. But what if his son is an idiot? Even though he's an educated idiot, and so they were doing that for a while, and then they would go to Rome or go to the court in Vienna or something like that, trying to negotiate some sort of basic economic deal, and he would get his clock cleaned, and then people would make fun of them afterwards about how and so I mean, this really did not sit well with Henry VIII, but also every other ruler was starting to experience the same sort of thing. So competence is all this is getting at. And this is in an age where being a generalist that can do all this, I don't know, I guess it's not a true generalist, but close enough. This is better than just knowing like military proficiency, because you got to be able to do all of it at the time. But much later on, as the world gets more complex, no, not so much, right? Even during the day, right? Like you want your people on your battlefield to know the longbows if you're leading a group of longbow archers. All right, this Renaissance gentleman, it's almost always an aristocrat. So again, we're still not talking about ordinary people. And so in her defense of liberal instruction of women, so I'm going to call them these precursors to the sort of the true rise that we're going to get later on. Here she presented a compendium of notable women from biblical heroines and classical writers to the outstanding women of her own day. So Soretta. The printing press. This is huge. So it's going to change everything for everybody. Also going to greater rise to literacy, which is going to change, going to really help out common people over time. So it's hard to wrap our minds around this now, but people just didn't have access to the books. So you couldn't just go to and get a Bible. Why? Because it was controlled. And you wouldn't be able to read it anyway. Why do you need to know how to read? Right? In this time period, like maybe some important people, they were getting trained to read, and then as the mercantiles were rising, they would pay for their children to get tutored. But most people, not so much. Right? What are you going to do with the Bible anyway? So it's always that you're hearing about things. But when the print technology hit, and that's just taking large sheets and essentially creating stamps. You're going to put some dye over the stamps, press them. They're going to go in this order that seems very odd, but after you fold the paper and cut the paper and stitch it together, and it all works out mathematically, then you've got a much, much cheaper way to create print. Well, that doesn't seem that crazy until you start talking about like what can happen with the Bible much later on. So not necessarily in 1527 all by itself, but later on as people start getting a hold of the Bible, start learning how to read and so on, well, you could, like the natural reaction is then, well, wait a minute. Well, look here. It says at the end of Mark that by your serpents you're going to know them, or something to that effect. I forget what it says exactly. And so then you get in a much later area, well, why am I listening to you? I can read this directly now, is the whole idea of the Protestant Reformation. They're like the Protestants, the protesters protesting the Catholic Church. They're getting away from all that, and then you're going to have complete misconstruction of that bit at the end of Mark much later on. Of course, back in my area with Tennessee and Kentucky, where the hillbillies are going to start using snakes, right? Because they think, well, you got to start here. This is the most important thing. I'm going to make this doctrinal, even though they're not calling it a doctrine. I'm going to make this distinction here. And so now you have the rise of what people still hear about. I don't really have a doctrine. We just follow Jesus. But that's never the case. As soon as you start thinking about it, you always have some sort of doctrine. So if you look at it and say, well, baptism is more, okay, well, that's the genesis of what we're going to call Baptists, or they called themselves at the time, right? And so on and so forth, and all the different Protestant denominations. Okay, Machiavelli. By himself was not really necessarily all. Matter of fact, he had to wait. I forget which Italian prince he was going to give this to for advice, but he got The guy right before him in line gave this prince 2 Great Danes, and by the time Machiavelli got to there to deliver the manuscript, the prince, the actual prince who was giving it to was more interested in the Great Dane and was like, oh yeah, put that there. Right? Did not care about it at all. But we did later on as people read it and they said, well, it seems like a real cutthroat way to run a state and all that. And sometimes some of this stuff makes sense, but a lot of stuff, shows up in movies, right? Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, because that way you can keep an eye on them. So, is there wisdom in that? Sure. Has that been around way before Machiavelli? You bet. Italian Renaissance art. So that was what I was talking about earlier. And then the High Renaissance later. Brunelleschi. They are rather obsessed with these, like, not really spires so much as now domes. Right? How do you make this space and that it can stay up over time? Because it's really impressive when you see it from the ground. So he figured out a way to do it that nobody figured out before. Alberti is so architecture, and we're just gonna skip to we're gonna start talking about the doors for the churches later on. Is where all this is leading to. So early Renaissance painting, linear or 1-point perspective. So now look at this, pay attention to this vanishing point, and let's see here. Vanishing back here. So now you're creating the illusion of depth. But it's not. There's no actual depth in the painting. The painting is 2-dimensional. Right? So this, there are actual people in an actual landscape. Here's the illusion anyway. Botticelli. Donatello. I used to make students compare and contrast this David, Donatello's David, with Michelangelo's David later. And it, like, who would you rather hang out with is very different than who would you rather have fight for you. And so it's that some of the responses are interesting, but this David, not necessarily the guy you want taken into battle and being on your side, beating it was the Philistines at the time. Okay, Ghiberti. So here's what we want to talk about with the doors. And so I don't even necessarily want to talk about these particular doors. They must have been impressive based on what people have said about them. Just the idea of a door to start out with, because I haven't talked about this before. You want to think of a door, the area around the door, in Middle Ages, and we're still kind of in there getting into it, as the bulletin board. So whereas now, so like y'all can at least remember cork boards when we had them, but the cork boards would just be in a hallway or something like that. There was nothing like that in the Middle Ages. Like if you wanted to know what was going on, you had to come to town. Remember, a lot of people were in the surrounding countryside tending to their land, so they don't know. So if something's going, say you're going to have a dance, say you're going to have a big meeting at the cathedral, say you're going to do anything as a town, where are you going to announce it? You're going to put it on the door. So much on, and you're going to tack it on there. So in an area around here. So in a much later period, we make a whole lot of Martin Luther goes and tacks his theses on the door that start Protestantism, like it's some kind of big rebellious act, and the ideas in them definitely are, but that he was putting them on the door? No, because that's where you put everything. That's where everybody put in anything of sort of the communal, the need for the community to know would go on the door. That's where you would announce the stuff. All right, we're starting to look a lot more impressive and military here. High Renaissance architecture, St. Peter's Basilica. Right, this incredibly impressive building. That's all the business with the new Pope. That was the building that they're doing all this. I think it was right next door to the Basilica. But if you walk into the, I mean, you have Michelangelo's Pieta, which is dead Jesus laying in Mary's lap. Right there. It's an incredibly powerful. It's behind bulletproof glass. As soon as you go in, it's the first thing you see on your right. And like a lot of things in Rome, there's just it doesn't do it justice to see it in a book. You have to go there and bring a good camera with a good zoom lens if you're going to Italy. Anyway, they don't really care if you take pictures in most of the places. Da Vinci. I mean, I might as well just highlight the name and then the whole chapter. It's just about everything he did. It was insanely talented. This is so Da Vinci is. People use the term genius. They throw it around too much, right? But Da Vinci, he was a genius. It was just insane, some of the stuff that he thought of in this time period. So everybody knows about the Last Supper. If you didn't know, he invented the idea of helicopters and some other things like that. Vitruvian Man, his drawing that we sent out in space. Raphael. I want to get to the School of Athens. Here is his most famous work, and this is Plato and Aristotle in the center. And notice again the illusion of debt here. You have Plato pointing up and Aristotle no, it's here on the ground. And then all these people are famous in antiquity, and he so in a much earlier time than Raphael. So he's going back to throughout history, all the way back to the ancient Greeks. And so you can identify all of these, and people have. And I think it's the case that as a work of art, if this is not the most written about work of art, it's like top 5. It starts to break it down a little bit in our book. Here, Michelangelo, same thing. I mean, goodness gracious. Michelangelo is a little obsessive, but he created the more manly David, and if I remember correctly, there's a lot of stress on this. By the way, the block existed before Michelangelo got just a block from the quarry has a whole interesting story by itself. I may post there's a really neat podcast on that. I may post and put it in your shell. But it's more about the block, like how they got it from the quarry, and which sat in this one town for a long time before Michelangelo ever got a hold of it. Creation of Adam, and this will sort of drive you crazy. But this behind here, so in the Sistine Chapel is fresco. So he's painting, he's letting plaster dry, and when it gets to the right degree of dryness, he's up on scaffold here, and then he's going in and painting it, and it's not really that large of a space all taken together. So at the end of the day, what drove everyone crazy around Michelangelo is that he would show up early, have the plaster start laying, he'd climb the scaffold, he would paint most of the day, maybe take lunch, maybe not take lunch, work the rest of the day, and then he would come down and he'd look at it from the bottom, and he'd go tear it down. break it up and tear it all apart. We're going to start over again tomorrow. These are just on small sections of what's going to eventually turn into the completed Sistine Chapel. He drove people crazy. He was a perfectionist. What we want to remember here is not necessarily, this is an important word, don't get me wrong, but I'm going to bring this up in a different context because there's going to be a future painter that just goes to town with this idea in a completely different context later on, and sort of turns art on its head at that time. So remember, when we go back to Titian, Venus of Urbino, Ottoman Empire. This is what I said was kicking off with the fall of Constantinople, with the rise of this empire. Okay, Renaissance music. Again, this is not my particular strong suit. but they did, as far as writing it down, that was good. And if you've never, I almost pulled up one of these, but you all have certainly seen in the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the dances that people would get into in courts, to where they'll put the backside of their palm of their hand against each other, and then sort of separate and go on to the next person, and then you the backside of the hand to backside of the hand, and the stringed instruments are playing, and then they'll kind of formally circle around and then go to the next person. And all of that is very orchestrated. That comes to, it was around before the Renaissance, but kind of comes to, I don't know about perfection or its highest form or something like that in the Renaissance. And I think that's it for this chapter. I know there's a lot and I skipped over a lot of stuff, but Renaissance, really important.